So I'm here at Prismic with Best Boss. I'm glad to be here with you, Wes. Can you introduce a little bit
Yeah,
yourself?
absolutely. My name is Wes Boss. I'm a full stack JavaScript developer, so I write a lot of React and Node. I have a podcast called Syntax FM, and I make some web development courses.
Cool. And we're here to talk about components, at different levels in React and in data, GraphQL, and in CSS. So can you introduce a bit, what components are?
Yeah. Components is it's a pretty hot word these days. We sort of talk about components and everything. And the way I see components in React are they're small modular building blocks. And they can do a number of different things. So first, a component in React could define what does it output? At the end of the day, what is the HTML that gets shown on the page? It can also define what does it do? What is the functionality of this specific component? Think about a menu or a shopping cart or something on your page. There's some functionality that's going to be tied to that. A component can also define what data is needed. Specifically in GraphQL, you can attach a query to that component or have a query that defines what data needs to be fetched for that thing to work. And then finally, a component could define what does it look like in CSS. What are the styles that need to be attached and scoped to this specific component?
And kind of thinking of components allow us to to focus on one thing at a time. Can you give us some example, more explain why design things into modular way with components?
Yeah, there's a couple benefits to it. I think one big one is the reusability. So whether you are building a special dropdown or a user avatar or a shopping cart, and you need to use that on multiple websites or multiple pieces in your application, and you may need to make it reusable. That's really, really simple. Generally, these components are very easy to test. So there's this whole idea of making Storybook, where this is not even React specific, but if you were to render out a component, that thing should be able to live on its own without any support from the rest of the application. So I always give an example of, think about it, sometime you coded something into your sidebar, and then you moved that into the footer and it broke. Maybe the CSS broke, maybe the data that was passed into it didn't make it there. That's not a great design because these components should be able to live on their own.
So what are the benefits of components at each level? In React, in data, in GraphQL, and in maybe styled components or CSS.
So in React, it's easy to make we follow the whole idea of one thing and one thing well. You make one little component that does one thing on your page, and at the end of the day, output something. Those are, like we said, those are easy to test. If we talk about the data aspect with GraphQL, generally the way that it's going these days is that you'll have this component on your page, maybe like a shopping cart, and you'll also have a query that comes along with that, because that shopping cart needs some data in order to work, right? So generally you'll attach a query to that component. Maybe you'll have it in the same folder or something like that. Where it comes along. And that's really cool because specifically in GraphQL, you only need to fetch the data that you specifically need for that component to work. And then when it comes around time to testing, it's very easy to mock up the potential data that thing needs because you've described just the pieces of data that specific component needs.
So it's more efficient because there's you fetch less data, you just precise what you want as data for that particular React component.
Yeah.
And it's also you kind of model the data the way you want it to be so that you don't have a lot of work into selecting data and kind of looping through data, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no unnecessary data. It's faster over the wire. Nesting data in GraphQL is really easy. So if you've got relational nodes where you want to fetch a user, you want to fetch their purchases, and you want to fetch related items to their purchases, you could pull that all in one single query and it'd be really simple.
Right. And the CSS part, and the style part.
So the CSS is pretty contested right now because you've got on one camp, people think, I'm fine with CSS. I'm really good with CSS. I don't have problems with my CSS. And then on the flip side, you also see people who think we badly need this componentization in our CSS. So And that's not to say you can't do components in regular CSS. That's been around for 10 years already. But so some of the benefits you have to that is first, you've got scoping. So if you ask yourself with your CSS, how will I know if adding or removing some CSS to this thing won't break something else on the page? And since the way that CSS works is that it's global, you don't necessarily have a good answer to that. So with any style components we'll use for an example, you can scope the CSS to a specific component, and the styles will only apply to that component. Of course, you will still have lots of global styles for things like fonts and general layout and all that stuff. So that's not to say that you will only be using this, but it can definitely be helpful in styles that need to be applied specifically only to a component.
Right, but for designers, like, isn't it a problem of this change of approach from using CSS to using like styled components? Is it like do they have to change the syntax? Do they have to kind of write different?
I think that was part of people's, like, they didn't like it at first, because a lot of the early implementations of it, you would have to write your CSS as an object. And then if you use dashes, you have to change the camel case, and you have to put quotes around your pixel values. And that's just a very awkward way to write CSS. None of the tools, if you use Emmet, none of the tools will work. And my favorite implementations of componentized CSS all allow you to write just regular CSS in backticks. Your highlighting is there. All of your tools still work. So I don't think that's much of an issue anymore.
But you still have some JavaScript there. You can use in some cases.
Yeah,
right?
it's a huge benefit to it. It definitely can be a bit of a foot gun, but you have all of JavaScript available to you inside of CSS. So if you need to do an if statement or calculate something or have access to a bunch of variables, you can do that via JavaScript and just have access to it inside of your style component.
So basically, if you're now, the global picture, if you're building a React app and you have a component in React, and then you have the query next to it, and you have the CSS component also next to it.
Yeah, exactly. The way that I use it is you just you create like a styled div or a styled button or something like that, and then you can reuse those buttons as you want, and you can just wrap your component in those style components. And that's really cool, because what I like about that is as soon as you stop using that specific styled component, let's say you built like a div and it's got a border around it and a background color, and you've written maybe 40 lines of CSS for that div. As soon as you stop using that component, it's automatically dropped from the bundle, meaning that there's no like dead code elimination that needs to happen, because as soon as I'm stopping using this component, then it's the same with JavaScript modules. As soon as you stop importing a module, it no longer makes its way into the final bundle, which will then make your website simpler.
Yeah, it's gone with all its dependencies, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.